Chapter 4 is Interpersonal Perception, and in this chapter we're going to discuss the process of perception, the fundamental forces in interpersonal perception, explaining what we perceive, and some tips for how to improve your perceptual abilities. Now let's provide a good working definition of the word perception. I've included a few definitions here, but I think a good summary is the first one: the process of interpreting or assigning meaning to the things we experience in our environment. The classic example of perception is the image here on the right side of the slide. We have the classic, is the glass half full or is it half empty quandary. This is an example perhaps of somebody who is an optimist on the left, with the glass is half full, versus a pessimist on the right, where the glass is half empty. The glass itself, it is one half of a glass of water. It in and itself has no meaning, but the individuals, when viewing it, assign meaning to it. And the optimist assigns that there is a half full glass of water, and the pessimist assigns that there's a half empty glass of water. He assigns a negative meaning to it. They're both smiling, so it makes this a little inaccurate, but if this were accurate, the guy on the left would probably be frowning. So that's perception. Now, interpersonal perception is basically the same thing as perception, but as you might guess, involving people. The definition here is interpersonal perception is the process of interpreting or assigning meaning to the people in our environment and our relationships with them. Now, I've included an image down below, and take a moment to look at this image and view the people individually that you see here. Now, based upon who you are, and perhaps your age, your ethnicity, your status as a parent, as a sibling, you may see different people in here than another person might see. So you might see a mother, a grandmother, a sibling, a sister, or a brother. Perhaps you see an African American and an Asian person and a Native American and some Caucasians. Perhaps you see some troublemakers. Perhaps you see loving children. Perhaps you see criminals. Everything depends basically upon your own perception of what you see. And if you ask 10 different people, they may point out 10 different perceptions of this group of people. This could be one unified family. It could be a collection of people just brought together for a photograph. Based upon, as I said, based upon who you are, you will see the people in this image differently, and that is your interpersonal perception. There are 3 stages in the perception process, the first of which is selection, followed by organization, and finally interpretation. So let's go back to the example of the half glass of water that the guy and the lady were looking at there. So if someone were to walk into a room and see the half glass of water, that would be selection. They are attending to a stimulus. They are identifying something of interest in the room. They are focusing on that. The organization process would, this is the process of categorizing the information that has been selected. So the organization process would be looking at the glass and identifying it as one half glass of water. That is an objective appraisal, just the factual part of this. And then our interpretation, which is really where the perception comes in, is the process of assigning meaning to the information that has been selected for attention and organized. And so the optimist will assign meaning to that half glass of water and say this half glass of water is half full, whereas the pessimist will assign a meaning to it through his interpretation that it is a half empty glass of water. Now, there are some things that may influence our perceptual accuracy, how we perceive things. We may perceive things inaccurately due to due to some of these things in this slide. The first of which is physiological states. I like to use this, it's called HALT, and this is the broken down. This is hungry, angry, lonely, tired. If I am hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, chances are that my perception will be skewed. Well, this is a good way to approach working with a child when the child is very irritable or fussy. Is the child hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? And usually hungry and tired takes care of most of it. Next up is culture. How do cultural differences impact our perception of each other? How does where we come from and how we were raised impact the way that we see one another? Finally, social roles. These are sets of behavior that are expected, and for example, gender roles. Traditional American gender roles, as they were in the 1950s, was that the man was the earner. He left the house to go work from 9 to 5 and to be the sole provider and the stronger figure in the relationship, whereas the woman would stay home and care for the children and clean the home and prepare meals and be somewhat subservient to the man. Now, as I said, these are gender roles that were prescribed in the 1950s, but seem to linger to a much lesser extent today. Now, stereotyping is a pretty common term, and this is basically making broad, sweeping generalizations about groups of people based upon information or the actions of a few. The definition from the text is the tendency to make generalizations about groups of people that are applied to individual members of those groups. An example from my life is I lived through 9/11. I was in college when 9/11 happened, and I noticed immediately following 9/11 that Muslim Americans and Muslims in general were demonized, not only by the press, but members of society. And in reality, 9/11 and the terrorist acts there were carried out by people that were in an extremely small margin of the Islamic community in general. This is far less than 1% of individuals in the Muslim community are considered radical extremists, and I think that's pretty consistent with all religions. The pie chart below is a report from the FBI on terrorist acts committed in the United States from 1970 up to 2012. You'll notice at the very bottom that 6% of the total terrorist acts in the United States were carried out by Islamic extremists. They are only second above communists at 5%. Everybody else, so they're the second lowest number of people who have committed terror, Islamic extremists here, committed terror in the United States. Above them are Jewish extremists, extreme left-wing groups, others, and Latino at 42%. And so this stereotype that people developed following 9/11 was in reaction to a very traumatic event, and we do have a natural tendency to scapegoat. But in reality, I believe that this stereotype may still persist, and it is entirely inaccurate. I question, or I challenge you to question what groups you stereotype. Perhaps that is along lines of ethnicity, perhaps it is along the lines of gender, or sexuality. So I encourage you to explore your own personal stereotypes. Now, everyone knows the importance of making a strong first impression when meeting someone or when applying for a job. Now, this is due to the primacy effect. And by definition, the primacy effect is the tendency to internally emphasize the first impression over later impressions. Now, the way that the human mind works is that when we first encounter a person and they make a very strong positive impression upon us, any information that we learn about that person or any future interactions that are positive will tend to bolster our impression or our perception or our overall feelings towards them. So positive stuff will make our impression of them more positive. If we have a strong first impression of the individual and we receive some negative information or perhaps have a negative interaction of them, generally, if the first impression was strong enough, we will discount that and still have good feelings about this person. And this is the converse, that if we have a strong negative first impression, that it will be harder to make that positive due to the strength of the negative initial perception, negative initial impression, and having to overcome that is a lot more challenging. So negative stuff will reinforce that negative impression, and positive will be discounted unless the positive eventually outweighs the initial negative. Now, the recency effect is a tendency to internally emphasize the most recent impressions over earlier impressions. And so that is the text uses the example of comedians and how important this concept of recency effect is to comedians, and that is even if you bomb your whole show, if you end strong with the last couple minutes, you end with them laughing, the chances of you getting hired to do more comedy shows is a lot higher. The chances of them coming back to a show to see you again is a lot higher if you leave on a high note. Entertainers of all kinds can certainly relate to this. So let's go back to our example of optimism and pessimism with the glass half full versus half empty. Now, with regard to this slide, perceptual sets are defined as the tendency to perceive only what we expect to perceive. So an optimist might perceive that the glass is half full because of the fact that they have, in general, positive perceptual sets, whereas the pessimist might perceive that the glass is half empty due to his or her negative perceptual sets. Another example might be similarly like an optimist walking around through the course of their day and smiling at people and only seeing the positive, and these are the things that the person attends to, whereas the optimist might only see the negative, and they could be walking down the same street. So positivity bias and negativity bias are interesting concepts. Positivity bias is the tendency to focus heavily on a person's positive attributes when forming an impression, and negativity bias is the tendency to focus on the person's negative attributes. An example I thought of is I have a friend who has dated a lot, and when she is excited about trying to find someone new, when she starts dating the person, she will tend to focus more heavily on the fellow's positive attributes and becomes very excited. When she is still dating and not very excited about it, she's feeling frustrated or defeated, she may go out with a guy and have a tendency to focus on his negative attributes, his big nose or his big ears or whatever. So this positivity and negativity bias are very important when forming impressions, and a lot of times it could be simply impacted by our perceptual state or our perceptual sets or whatever. We all attempt to explain behavior through attributions, and an attribution defined as an explanation for an observed behavior. Whenever we see a behavior, we attempt to assign a meaning to it, or we want to understand where the behavior is coming from. This is a very natural part of being human. And an attribution defined as an explanation for an observed behavior. An example of an attribution might be observing an individual swerving on the highway and attributing this, trying to explain this as to the individual is intoxicated. Whether or not this is the truth is beside the point, because we are making an attribution that it is so. Another concept is controllability, and controllability is defined as the belief that the cause of a behavior is under the person's control. I work with individuals with addictions, and it is common for family members to assume that the addict is in control of his or her behavior. And this is a source of frustration for family members who have the feeling that if this person would just stop, if the person would just stop using or just stop hurting me, that our family would be well, as if to imply that the individual has control over his or her behavior. This may manifest in a number of other areas where somebody is just not aware of how they behave or the impact that they may be having on others. Now, it's important to note that we each have some common attribution errors, the first of which is self-serving bias. Now, this is the tendency to attribute one's successes to internal causes and one's failures to external causes. Now, this is the self-serving bias. Basically is that we will only see the good in ourselves and not the bad. We will only own responsibility for our accomplishments and place responsibility for our faults onto others or onto our environment. An example might be an athlete who wins an event and praises himself, or loses the event and blames it on the environment, on the track, or on the field, or on the coach, or on his opponents. A fundamental attribution error is the tendency to attribute others' behaviors to internal rather than external causes. And an example of this might be a driver in traffic who cuts you off and seems to be speeding and driving erratically. We might attribute this to this person being a jerk or being aggressive, when in reality the person may have a sick child in the car and they are rushing to get the child to the hospital. It's common for us to respond negatively when people are aggressive in traffic, but taking a moment to pause and check our perception, we may look at it from another way and say this person may be in a rush for some other reason, and I know that this helps to dismantle some of my frustration. Now, here are some tips for improving your perceptual abilities. Always be mindful of your perceptions and your value judgments of things and of people. First, know yourself. This is absolutely critical. It is important to know who you are and your biases, your predispositions, and everything that makes you up, and how this might impact the way that you interact with others and the way that you see others, depending upon the culture that you're in, or your gender. All of these things are involved in how you perceive others. Attend to others' characteristics, and here we're discussing gender and culture. It's always important to know that other people, based upon their gender or culture, may not see things as you do. They may see things in a radically different way. Well, it's important when examining someone in a situation or when interacting to acknowledge that someone may have characteristics different from yourself. Consider the context. Different people may behave in different ways in different situations. If I were to make a generalization about people based upon watching them at a football game or in the grocery store, I might say that people are extremely agitated and excitable, or that people might be rude and self-focused, on those two examples respectively. It's important to separate our interpretations from facts. It's important to acknowledge that everything that we see is tainted by the lens through which we see, and this is our perception. When frustrated, for me, sometimes it is helpful to take a look at how I might be perceiving or misperceiving the situation, examine the facts, and reassess the situation. It's important to envision from others' perspectives, to examine how other people might see or might experience the situation, or perhaps another way that you might. There's a great flow chart on page 138 that I found helpful, that may be helpful to you on how to be mindful of your perceptions. If you take nothing else from this course, I hope that you take this.